When I left the Royal Huts Inn to visit the Devil's Punch Bowl and Gibbet Hill, I passed along a wide straight road, the new high road between London and Portsmouth, and shortly came to the edge of the Punch Bowl and easted my eyes on its beauty. The fog, which had been heavy in London when I left on this mid-October morning, hung in the valleys so that the tops of the Surrey hills rose like islands from the sea of mist, and in the brilliant sunshine which glorified these upper levels softened and mellowed all the wide expanse of hill and dale and down which ranged between me and the southern coast. The hill gave steeply on all sides save the northwest, where the circular valley opened to the plain below. All the summer tints were chastened and mellowed. All the full colors which the sunshine had glorified now faded into the sere of autumn. The pink and purple of the heather were changed to rich amber and faded yellow, and the grasses and wildflowers had donned their winter garb, the hues of decay. Through all these rich autumn tints, the bramble, untouched as yet by the frost, sent an emerald flash. The green bushes which fringed the tiny stream running through the valley seemed of supernatural vividness, and the dark green of the pines which covered the western slope seemed to assert the right of nature to maintain her own color despite all influences. Away to the north and west, past the spurs and shoulders of the hill, the woods and valleys, the copses and villages and hills and ridges ranged in endless succession, and it was after a long, long pause that I turned from drinking in the beauty of the scene, with my heart full of the power and majesty and purifying influence of nature's beauty. Here, said I to myself, at least the soul of man is elevated, and on this higher plane of nature's handiwork the evil of our hearts is lulled. As I turned, however, I started, for there beside me was a tombstone by the roadside, marking the spot where a century ago a poor man was murdered. But not only the stone was of interest, for there were 3 figures by it which would have arrested attention anywhere. They were only children. 2 were young girls about some 13 or 14 years. They stood on each side of the memorial, each with a slim brown hand resting on an elbow of the stone, looking at me gravely with long, dark, fathomless eyes. They were both very pretty, and their slim, girlish figures were draped in black of some shimmering material, with a wide belt round the waist and dark material wound around the head. The third of the group was a little boy of some 10 years old, with hair of spun gold, eyes like blue porcelain, and a winning smile on his rosy face. He wore a dark, blood-colored tunic. For a few seconds I stood looking at this group, they regarding me without the slightest movement. Then I spoke to them, making some remark about the beauty of the scene. One of the girls spoke, tapping the stone with her hand as she said, "Can you tell us anything about this stone, sir? We are strangers." "I am a stranger here myself," I answered, "but I think we will find it here." I proceeded to read aloud the inscription on both sides of the stone. When I read the word murder, they all 3 looked at each other, and then at me, and shuddered, and, strange to say, followed the shudder with a smile. I thought they might be frightened, and I hastened to add, "But you need not let that disturb you. It all happened 100 years ago, when the country was very different from what it is now." "I hope not," one of the girls said in a low voice. The little boy looked up at me with a laugh and said, "I suppose if there were a murder now, someone would be stuck up on Gibbet Hill." "You know all about it, I see," said I. "I'm going to the hilltop to see the memorial cross. Will you come?" "With pleasure," he said, lifting his cap in acknowledgement of my invitation. The girls bowed as well, and we all moved up the hill together. As we went, I noticed that the boy had one of his hands tightly clenched. "What have you got there?" I asked of him. He opened his hand and showed me a crumpled mass of earthworms, wiggling in their sudden freedom. "I love worms," he said. "Poor worms," said I. "Why not let them go? They would much rather be on the ground." "I shan't," was his only reply, as he shoved them back into the folds of his tunic. There were a lot of people at the cross when we reached the top of Gibbet Hill, beside abundant evidence of recent visitors in the shape of eggshells and newspapers, for the cross was a favorite picnicking spot. I soon became so absorbed by the lovely view which stretched before me, a wilderness of rising hilltops with green woods and rich valleys, that I quite forgot my young companions. I went to the edge of the steep hill and sat down looking eastwards, and lost myself in the beauty of the scene. Presently, I remembered my young companions and looked around for them, but they had quite disappeared. There was not a sight of them anywhere around. I took my way to a deep, shady grove of hazel and beech with tall pines rising over all, one of those dense copses that creep up from the valley, throwing jagged spikes of greenery up the slopes of the hill. My departure from London had been early, and the walk in the blazing October sun fatiguing, so after a while, when I had been all around the summit, I took my way to a deep shady grove of hazel and beech with tall pines rising over all, one of those dense copses that creep up from the valley, throwing jagged spikes of greenery up the slopes of the hill. The undergrowth grew luxuriously under the shelter of clustering pines. The brown of the bark and the bluish bloom of the foliage, the sweet, aromatic odor which they exhaled, the sleepy silence accentuated only by the hum of nature's vitalities, the soft, rich grass whose summer greenery stood untouched. Here was the very perfection of autumn fullness. With a blissful feeling of content, I stretched myself on the grass, and soon lost my thoughts and my consciousness in the interlacing branches above me. How long I slept, I know not, but it must have been a good while. There was, however, no press of coming work, which in such cases destroys the charm of awaking. I knew there was ample time before me, and that I could revel to my heart's content in the freshness and purity of this wonderful spot. And so I lay on my back, with my hands under my head, looking up into the branches and watching the gleams of light struggle through the tracery of leaves. There was in the air the same faint hum of varied sounds which had at first lulled me to sleep, but somehow the volume was richer than before, more full and satisfying to the ear, and with a special significance, as if all nature was speaking, but that there was one voice more potent than the rest. It was not as if it grew in loudness, but merely as if the vibrations accumulated, coming in waves more quickly than they could die away, and gradually I heard only this one sound. In general effect, it was like a sort of musical muffled bird call, a corncrake in a whisper, but with some subtle prevailing sweetness of almost irresistible attraction. I raised my head from the bracken where I lay and looked where the sound proceeded. There, to my surprise, were the children whom I had seen. The two girls were seated, and between them the little boy stood up. One of the girls held a set of pipes slightly thicker than wheaten straws. Across this, she drew something attached to the fingers of her right hand, which made the base of the strange sound. The other girl held a shell with strings across it, and the boy had a sort of reed flute which gave forth a long, sweet note which blended in the mass of music. By and by the girls stood up. They all turned slightly, and I could see that they were evidently turning slowly in a complete circle. As they began to face my direction, I sank down so that they might not see me, and a very short time elapsed before my attention was diverted. Hearing a stir among the dead leaves beside me, I looked around and almost jumped to my feet, for there, close by and approaching closer, was a large snake. It came straight towards me and actually passed over my feet. I did not stir, and it went on, heeding me no more than if I had been a log of wood, and wiggled away towards the group in the sunlit glade. It was evidently attracted by the music, and the snake approached closer and closer, till at the feet of the fair-haired child it stopped, and, curling itself into a spiral, raised its head and began to hiss. The boy looked down, and the girls turned their eyes toward him, but the music did not stop for a moment. It grew quicker. Then the snake twined itself around the child's ankle, and began to climb its way up his body, round and round his leg and thigh, and up, till at last it crawled along the arm that held the flute. Then suddenly the music stopped, and the boy stretched out his arm with the snake around it, with his hand open, palm upwards. The snake remained perfectly still, as if transformed into stone. Then the girls took hands and circled slowly around the boy, uttering a low, whispering, mysterious chant, something the same as the earlier one, but this time in a minor key. The boy remained perfectly still, with his arm extended and his blue eyes fixed on the snake. Then the latter raised its head slightly and seemed to follow the movements of the circling girls. They continued, round and round, the snake's movements more and more pronounced with each revolution, till it was boldly turning around the boy's arm. Gradually, the motion of the girls and the low crooning music died away altogether, and the snake hung as limp as a string across the boy's hand. The girls let go of each other's hands, and one of them, who had stopped just in front of the boy, took the snake by its head and tail and seemed to gently pull it out straight, and lay it across the boy's hand as stiff as a piece of wood. Then began some questioning between them in a language which I did not understand. Both voices were sweet, but one of them I seemed instinctively to fear, although it was the sweeter and softer of the two. Somehow, and the idea was quite spontaneous, it seemed to suggest murder. When each girl in turn had her say, and they suggested positive and negative in their tones, the snake would slowly turn around like the needle in a compass and point its head to either one. The sweeter voice seemed to be the positive, and the other the negative, which seemed to annoy the positive inquirer. And her voice grew more deadly sweet and penetrating until it made me shudder. Then she seemed to get more and more enraged, for her eyes gleamed with a dark, unholy light, and at last came her question in a keen, thrilling whisper. The snake spun round quicker and suddenly came to a dead stop in front of the other girl. The disappointed one gave a fierce, short, sharp sound like a dog's bark, while a look of deadly malice swept over her face. At the same instant, the snake collapsed and hung as limp as before, and then slipped to the ground and lay there without motion, as if dead. The boy began to laugh. The girls joined, and in an instant the glade, which had seemed so weird, grew with laughter, as the children chased each other into the wood and disappeared from view. I rose up from the bracken. I could hardly believe my eyes, and I thought that I must have been sleeping and dreamt it all. But the seemingly dead snake lay before me as palpable evidence that I had beheld reality. The sun was far in the west when I found myself once more at the highest point on Gibbet Hill. The place was now deserted. The picnickers had all gone home, the parties of school children had disappeared, and nothing remained of the day's visitation but the usual increase in old newspapers and broken eggshells. As the light was just beginning to fade and the air to grow a shade colder, the sense of loneliness was more than ever marked. But I had come from the midst of the hum and turmoil of the city to enjoy this very loneliness, and its luxury was to me unspeakable. Down in the valleys the mist lay dim and fleecy white, and from it the hilltops rose dark and grim. A belt of cloud fringed the whole horizon, and above it stretched a sea of sulphur yellow, flecked here and there with little clouds of white, which, swimming high above the level of the hill, caught the last splendors of the sun, now obscured by the horizon. 1 or 2 stars began to twinkle through the darkening sky, and a stillness that seemed sentient stole up through the valley and reached where I sat. Then the air grew colder, and the silence became perfect, and a soft light fell on the scene. I sat on and leaned with my back against the great stone cross, and putting my hands behind me, wrapped my arms around its back so as to drink in the wondrous beauty in which I was immersed. Suddenly, each hand was grasped from behind and held tight in a pair of hands, so strong I could make no movement, and a scarf of thick material was thrown over my face and drawn tightly from behind, holding my head close to the stone. My hands were tied around the wrists and drawn tight, and I took for granted that I was being prepared for robbery. I was alone, far away from everyone, and in the hands of men stronger than I was myself, secretly thankful that I had only a small sum of money with me. After a time which seemed long, but was probably a few minutes' duration, the scarf was pulled down so that my eyes were free, though my mouth was still covered and I was unable to cry out. There were the 3 children who had arrested my attention earlier in the day. They stood before me perfectly still and silent for a little while, their eyes being the only features which expressed consciousness or interest of any kind. The boy and 1 girl smiled on me with an amused superiority, while the other, who in the glade had exhibited such anger, smiled with a deadly cold hate which made me shudder. The latter then approached me closer, the others remaining still and looking on with their amused smile. She took from her waist, where it was concealed in the folds of her dress, a long, sharp dagger. She proceeded to flourish before me with extraordinary dexterity and rapidity. Its keen edge touched my skin, and the contact made me wince. Then she would dart towards my eyes till I could feel its cold point actually touching my eyeballs, and she would hurl herself at me with the point of the deadly weapon directed at my heart, but would stop just as it seemed that my last moment had come. I felt a cold chill, a strange numbness growing over me. My heart seemed to get cold and weak, colder and colder, weaker and weaker still, till at length my eyes closed. I tried to open them, succeeded, tried again, failed, succeeded, failed, and at length consciousness passed away from me. The last thing I remember seeing was the gleam of the long knife in the starlight. The last sound I heard was a low laugh from all 3 of the children. My consciousness struggled back into existence, and I opened my eyes. It was now much brighter, for a great yellow moon had arisen. A man was bending over me, shaking me roughly by the shoulder, while a lady stood by, looking on anxiously with her hands clasped. "He's not dead, George, is he?" I heard her say. "It is a mercy that you had the inspiration to come out and see the moonlight view, or he might have died of cold. He must have fallen asleep." "My heart," I murmured. "My heart," for it was icy cold. The past was coming back to me quickly now, and I asked him, "Did you see anywhere some children? 2 girls and a boy." "Yes, hours ago as they went down the road on a tricycle," the man said. "They were laughing, and we thought them the prettiest and happiest children we had ever seen." "But why?" "My heart," I cried out again, for there was a coldness which seemed to numb me. The man put his hand over my heart, but quickly tore it away with a cry of terror. "What is it, George? What is it?" shrieked the lady. He stood back, and she clung frightened to his arm, as a large worm wriggled itself out of my chest, fell on the ground, and glided down the hillside into the trees below. The
The laughter of her friends echoed in the chilly night air as Sally hugged them one by one, feeling the warmth of their bodies against her own. Their evening had been filled with delectable food and drinks that slid down her throat like liquid gold. Her tummy was full, she was a little tipsy, and suddenly exhausted. "Are you sure you don't want us to call you a cab?" Tina asked with furrowed brows, her breath visible as she spoke from the porch. "No, I'll be fine," Sally reassured her, a confident smile plastered to her face. "It's not even 20 minutes on the subway, and they've got security walking around." In reality, Sally didn't feel as confident as she sounded, but she didn't want to trouble her friends any further, nor could she afford the expense of a cab. "All right, if you say so," Tina replied hesitantly, still not entirely convinced. "Just call me when you get home, okay? I'm staying up until I hear from you." "Will do," Sally promised, offering a final wave before turning towards the direction of the train station. The shadows cast by the towering buildings loomed over her as she navigated the maze of empty streets. Sally would never get used to the way one could find themselves in another world entirely, just a stop or two away from home. She quickened her pace as the icy wind howled through the concrete canyons, the only sound at all aside from her heels taking turns against the pavement. Rounding a corner, Sally caught sight of the familiar entrance to the subway station. Grimacing, she descended the steps into the bowels of the underground. As she reached into her bag for the train pass, she found herself talking aloud. "Just a few stops," she told herself. "I'll just wait by security until the train arrives." The flickering fluorescent lights cast distorted shadows across the platform, and as she got closer, Sally's heart sank. The security office, her only source of comfort, was empty and dark before her. Where are they? Sally wondered, her heart pounding in her ears. She glanced around, anxious to appear calm and cool in case any strange eyes were following her. Yet, she saw nothing but the vacant benches and glowing ticket machines and clusters of trash and papers decorating the ground. She scanned her pass and went through the gates, which elicited a two-tone sound of acknowledgement that echoed through the empty station. As she reached the escalators, she found that they had been turned off, so she hurried down the stairs 2 at a time, reaching the empty platform in seconds and glancing around once again for any sign of the security officer. But there was no one. Nothing. Even the screens which displayed train arrival times were blank. Maybe Tina was right, Sally admitted silently, regretting her quick dismissal when her friend expressed concern. She glanced at her watch, counting the seconds as they ticked by, each one stretching on for an eternity. A sudden gust of wind swept through the station, creating a blizzard of loose debris and nearly snatching Sally's spirit from her body entirely. Then her terror gave way to relief, which in turn morphed into disappointment as she realized the arriving train was headed in the opposite direction. Sally hugged herself, trying in vain to shake off the chill that seemed to emanate from within. As she waited, her eyes darted around nervously, searching for the approaching train as the other continued on its way, with no sign of anyone in its green windows at all. She hadn't even noticed an operator in the front car. In the distance, she caught a glimpse of movement, and after allowing her eyes to focus on the faraway shadows, she spotted a figure at the other end of the platform. The dark, hulking shape swayed side to side as it moved forward slowly, and for a moment, Sally considered that the shadows themselves had come to life before her. The figure grew nearer and nearer, slowly shuffling and swaying along, and still with no discernible features. Sally's breath caught in her throat as she considered heading back upstairs for security, but she didn't want a chance missing the train. She clenched her fists tightly as beads of sweat formed on her brow. With a quick glance, she confirmed that the shadow was getting closer and closer. Then, a distant rumble tickled Sally's ears, and she eagerly looked into the tunnel at the headlights speeding toward her like a shooting star. Looking back, she saw the mysterious figure was only a few hundred feet away and was coming directly for her. "Come on, come on, come on," she said, watching the gleaming silver cars grow closer and closer. Suddenly, the dark figure was directly beside her, and she screamed, hurling herself into the nearest train car just as the doors slid open with a deafening hiss.
"You got $1?"
A raspy voice asked from behind her. Startled, Sally whirled back around to find herself face to face with a disheveled woman, buried inside of a massive, tattered coat, with its large hood pulled over her matted hair in protection.
"Sorry, dear. Didn't mean to scare you."
With shaking hands, she fumbled through her bag for a few singles. Yeah," she stammered, trying to force a polite laugh that presented more as a choking grunt. "Don't worry about it. I'm just a little jumpy, I guess."
"Thank you, dear."
The woman took Sally's offering gratefully and shared a sweet smile in return.
"You get home safe now."
With another hiss, the door between them closed, and the train jolted back into movement. Sally sighed in relief as the exterior became a blur of flickering lights and reflections and shadows, and settled into a seat nearby. Like the station, the car was empty, as were the ones in front of and behind her from what she could see. She may have been the only passenger on the entire train. Just 4 stops, she thought, counting down in her head as the train rattled along the tracks. I'll be in bed before I know it. The screech of the train pulling into the next station split the air, drowning out the rhythm of its wheels on the tracks. The doors slid open to admit a trio of young men in messy suits, their laughter and slurred speech announcing their arrival before they even staggered into view. They lurched through the doors, arms wrapped around each other for support, practically carrying the man in the middle, who could barely stand. "Look at this guy," one of them hooted, his words thick with drunken mirth. He seemed to be missing his necktie. "Can't handle his liquor." "Easy, man," said the other one doing the lifting. Though he still wore a tie, this fellow had accessorized his dress shirt with a few dark stains, and the pant of his right leg was tucked into his sock. The man in the middle sat limp as his eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, then locked onto Sally with a sudden intensity that made her blood run cold. Panic clawed at her, but she refused to let it take hold. Instead, she pulled a novel from her bag, burying her face between its pages in an effort to escape his gaze. "Don't let us bother you, miss," No Necktie said with a sheepish grin. "He's just had a bit too much." Sally tried to focus on the words in front of her, but found herself unable to make sense of the jumble of letters, her eyes scanning over the same line over and over, comprehending nothing. "Shouldn't have let him drink so much," the other muttered, shaking his head. "But I guess that's how we learn, right?" Sally risked a glance up from her book, relieved to find the man in the middle had nestled his head onto the shoulder of the man beside him. He had passed out, and though she was still thoroughly uncomfortable, Sally couldn't help but find it humorous to see a trio of grown men practically cuddling together in public. The subway train came to a stop at the next station, and the man in the stained shirt gently lifted his friend's flaccid head towards the other. "Sorry, buddy, this is me. You good to take care of him?" "Of course," No Necktie responded, grinning again with a flashing glance in Sally's direction. "See you later." As the car jolted into movement once again, the book slipped from Sally's grasp, landing on the floor directly in front of the pair. She quickly stood and plucked it up from the floor, wiping away the mysterious fuzz that now stuck to its cover. "Sorry, excuse me," she mumbled, shifting back to her spot. Though she was tempted to find another seat further away, she didn't want to draw any extra attention from the men. "You ever drink too much?" the conscious man asked Sally. She had no desire to respond, but couldn't risk escalation. "Don't underestimate the anger of a man ignored," Tina often reminded her. "No, not really," she said meekly. "I don't mean to be rude, but I'm really close to finishing my book." The man's smile widened. "Come on, that ain't true. Pretty girl on the train this time of night had to be getting into some trouble." Sally held her breath, staring at the page before her as she tried to recall which stop they were at without looking up. She couldn't wait to bail for the safety of her apartment. Whatever," the man said. "He'll be just fine, just needs to sleep it off." Yeah, Sally stammered, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "I get it." He paused, and she knew he was watching her as she kept her eyes on the book in front of her. Then he continued, in a lower voice. "You know, you'll never finish that book there if you don't turn the page." Sally laughed nervously. "I'm not great at multitasking," she said. The sharp cry of the train slowing into the next station interrupted them, and No Necktie gently shifted his friend's weight so that he now leaned against the wall. "Well, this is me," he said, standing and approaching the door. "Don't worry about him, miss, and get those pretty legs of yours home. Nothing good happens this time of night." As the doors slid shut behind the departing drunk, Sally found herself alone with the unconscious man, silently slumped against the window as the train continued towards its next destination, Sally's stop. Though she was glad to see the others go, she was appalled at these so-called friends for leaving the man like this. He was practically dead weight, and they abandoned him on the plastic bench like a forgotten glove. Sally wondered if she could get the operator's attention when she left the train, or if there might be security patrolling on the next platform. Suddenly, she felt responsible for this utterly creepy stranger, and imagined reading in the news the next day about a man robbed or worse after falling asleep drunk on the subway. She had almost placed her book back inside of her bag when she was hit by a sudden wave of terror. What if this man wasn't unconscious at all, and simply waited for his chance to follow her off the train? She didn't want to indicate that she was preparing to leave, and quickly considered ways she could shake him off if he followed, whether he was stumbling drunk or stone-cold sober. But her apartment was only 2 blocks from the station, and there was little she could do besides bursting into a sprint if the man indeed began to stalk her. At long last, the train began its gentle arc around the curve nearing the platform, and Sally planned to erupt from her seat and through the doors at the last possible second. The train seemed to be taking the curve quite swiftly, but she didn't mind. Anything to get home sooner. With the turn complete, the subway pulled into the station and came to an extremely sudden stop. Then, in one horrible moment, 3 things happened simultaneously. First, the doors of the train opened with a hiss, welcoming a heavy wave of stale, freezing air from the platform. Second, Sally pulled herself up from her seat, stepping towards the door as swiftly as she could. And third, the unconscious man slipped from the bench, face-planting directly in Sally's path with a sickening thud, and causing her to trip, tumbling into the open doorway and dropping her book to the tracks below. Sally looked at the stranger on the floor in front of her and shrieked with utter terror. The back of his head was crusted with blood, surrounding a fresh bullet hole in the center of his skull. Moments before, Sally had locked eyes with a corpse and conversed with his killers. The man in the middle had been dead the whole time.
Hugo lived alone. He had no family, no real friends, not even a pet.
Monday through Friday, he went to work at the office as an accountant. Every day he added columns of numbers, and once every 2 weeks he made out the paychecks for the company. That was the closest he'd ever come to the other employees, typing their names on a paycheck. Hugo spent the weekends alone. On Saturdays he watched television, and he carefully read through every piece of junk mail that he received during the week. Hugo always answered the ads for free information. On Sundays he read the newspaper and took a walk. He didn't mind living such a solitary life. He didn't like people, really. But sometimes Hugo could tell when he had been alone too long. Sometimes when he had to talk to someone, his voice sounded like a stranger's. When that happened, he would make a point of eating out in a restaurant. He would ask the waitress questions and listen to what other people were saying, and that usually got him back to normal. One Monday morning, Hugo woke up at exactly 7:30 as he did every other morning. It had been a 3-day weekend because of a holiday on Friday. Hugo had not left his apartment for 3 days. The weather had been too bad to take a walk on Sunday, so he had stayed in to watch television and read the papers. Hugo groaned and stumbled out of bed. His head felt groggy this morning. He went into the bathroom and turned on the cold water. Then he splashed his face with the water to try and clear his head. But he still felt strange. After he dried his face, Hugo looked in the mirror. He always did that in the morning. Hugo looked in the mirror for a long time this morning. He didn't seem to be thinking straight, and what he saw in the mirror didn't make sense. He stared straight into the reflection of his eyes. Then he looked at his nose, his mouth, his forehead. The more he looked at himself, the more it seemed that he was looking at the face of a stranger. "That's not me," he thought to himself. "That can't be me." But as he moved his face up and down, the reflection also moved up and down. Hugo shut his eyes and shook his head back and forth. Then he looked at the mirror again. The stranger's face hadn't gone away. It was staring right back at him. "My God," said Hugo. He put his hands to his face, and it did the same. Suddenly he needed to know if he was still himself. He ran to the closet. His clothes were all neatly hung in rows, arranged according to color. He pulled open a dresser drawer. His wallet was there, and his driver's license still had his name on it. Hugo sighed with relief. Then he looked up at the mirror over the dresser. The stranger was looking back at him. "That isn't me," Hugo said in a trembling voice. "I don't look like that." Hugo dressed himself in one of his oldest suits, one that he had worn hundreds of times. It made him feel secure. Then he went into the kitchen, put on some coffee, and poured himself a bowl of cereal. As he picked up the big spoon, he saw the stranger's distorted face staring at him upside down. "I don't look like that," Hugo repeated. Suddenly, he thought of a way to prove it. A picture, he thought. There must be a picture of me. But he couldn't think of any. No one had ever taken a picture of him that he could remember. He began to shake inside. There had to be a way to prove that he was not the stranger that he saw reflected in the mirror. By now it was 8:15. He would have to be at his desk in 45 minutes. Hugo didn't know what to do. He couldn't go into his office looking like a stranger, but he couldn't stay home either. It was the 15th of the month. The employees were supposed to get their checks today. Hugo got ready to go to the office. He avoided looking in any mirrors. As he locked the door to his apartment, his neighbor, Mrs. Reynolds, passed him on the street. "Good morning, Hugo," she said, and Hugo returned her greeting. Then he realized what it meant. He looked like his old self to her. He almost went back to the apartment to check the mirror again, but then he remembered that there was a mirror at the front of the bus that he would ride to the office. He walked to the bus stop and waited, humming a song. He felt better now. The bus pulled up and Hugo walked on. As he gave the driver his money, he stooped to look in the mirror. To his horror, the stranger stared back, with an eager grin on his face. Hugo slumped into a seat. He rode all the way to his office with his eyes shut. There was a window by his seat, and every time he looked at it, the reflection of the stranger's face was there. At 9 o'clock, Hugo was in his office at his desk. He sat there, waiting for someone to notice, but no one did. The women who worked in the accounts department with him acted perfectly normal. They paid no more attention to him than they usually did. Hugo felt as though he were going mad. 4 times during the day he went to the restroom to check. The mirror always confirmed his fears, that he looked like a total stranger, and no one even noticed. Hugo went home that night and went directly to bed. He hid in the dark bedroom until sleep put his exhausted mind to rest. When he woke the next morning, he was afraid to look in the mirror. He avoided it, but he had to shave if he went to work. It was hard shaving the stranger's face. His hands were shaking. It went like that Tuesday morning and Wednesday morning and Thursday morning. Friday morning, Hugo woke up at 7:15 and lay in bed for a very long time. He didn't want to get up. He felt as though he couldn't go on living with that stranger's face. He stayed in the bedroom for an hour. Finally, the fear of being alone with the face all day forced him out of bed. He decided he would go to work, even though he was late. He went to the bathroom and began to shave automatically. Then he dropped the razor. It was his old face, his own face back in the mirror again. Hugo ran his hands all over his face. It really was him. This was how he looked. He let out a crazy laugh. The stranger had gone, disappeared, and he was himself again. Hugo finished shaving, dressed, and rushed out of the house without having breakfast. He was eager to get to work now, eager to have people see him. As he was locking the front door, Mrs. Reynolds passed by on the street. She looked at him suspiciously and didn't say good morning, but Hugo was too happy to notice that she was acting strangely. He sprang up the steps into the bus and handed the driver his money. Stooping down, he saw his own face smiling back at him in the driver's mirror. On the ride to the office, he would turn to the window every few minutes. He wanted constant reassurance that his face would be there in the reflection, and it always was. At 9:30, Hugo pushed open the door to the accounts department. The receptionist was calling to him from her desk in the hallway, but he didn't pay attention. He just wanted to get to his desk because he was late. Hugo strode across the room to his desk, which sat in a corner. He put his briefcase on the desk and sat down in his chair. He noticed the constant sound of typing in the room had stopped. Now there was no sound at all, as a matter of fact. Hugo smiled as he saw Miss Rose, the head clerk, walking toward his desk. "Yes, Miss Rose," he said. Miss Rose stopped a few feet from his desk. "Who are you?" she asked. Hugo laughed at the joke. Miss Rose was being especially friendly today. "Why are you sitting in Hugo's desk?" Miss Rose demanded. And Hugo stopped laughing. He looked into Miss Rose's eyes. The truth crept like a sinister madman into his mind. Miss Rose was looking at a total stranger. He could see that she didn't recognize him. Hugo gripped both sides of the desk. "Who are you?" Miss Rose repeated. But Hugo didn't answer. His mind was too busy, making its strange, spiraling descent into total madness.
Many people have a phobia, an unnatural fear they can't control. But Ellen's phobia bordered on the fringe of madness. She would go into hysteria even at the sight of a small field mouse. Perhaps she had a right to be afraid, after what happened that night. It was late when Ellen left the small restaurant where she had eaten dinner alone. The restaurant stood on one side of the large city park, and because it was a warm summer night, Ellen decided to walk through the park to her apartment on the other side. She started down a path overhung by leafy trees. It was surprisingly dark on the path, dark enough to make Ellen feel uneasy. She quickened her pace, thinking she should get to the other side of the park as soon as possible. She had heard stories about things, unpleasant things, that happened to people in the park at night. Then, coming out of the shaded path into an open area, she saw the sky was still light. She decided to walk a little slower, but she couldn't completely forget her uneasiness, or the stories. She walked on through the park toward the lake in the middle. Soon another path loomed ahead, shaded by thick trees. Ellen looked in the distance down the path. No one seemed to be on it. She looked behind her, wondering if she should turn back around. But by now she had walked into the center of the park. There was no point in turning back. Once on the shaded path, she could hear no sounds but the rustle of leaves. The sounds of the city were drowned out here. Ellen walked on, listening to the leaves whispering in the night air. She felt as though she were 1,000 miles from civilization. But then her ears picked up another sound. It wasn't a sound from the city outside, and it wasn't a sound from the trees either. She listened to her own footsteps on the cement path, and told herself that was all she had heard. But no, she heard it again, an echo of her own footsteps behind her. She was sure of it now. There were other footsteps following her. Fear crept into her mind. It made her heart pound and her legs walk faster. Soon Ellen knew she had reason to be afraid. The footsteps behind were keeping pace with hers. They had quickened with her own. She kept herself from running, knowing she must not show her fear. She knew she must stay in control of herself. Forcing her legs to slow down, she realized the footsteps behind her were not slowing down. They came up from behind, quickly, eagerly. Ellen couldn't control her fear any longer. She broke into a run down the path. The footsteps didn't follow right away, but then, over the pounding of her heart, she heard them hitting the pavement, fast and steady. Ahead, Ellen saw the path that went down to the lake. She knew that people more often came to the lake than any other place in the park. She ran down a small hill toward the lake. As she rounded a corner, her heart sank. The path by the lake was deserted too, and now the footsteps behind her were coming down the hill and were catching up to her. Ellen looked around wildly. There was a dense area of bushes and trees to her left. She ran on for a few steps and then threw herself into hiding in the bushes. Maybe, she prayed, the footsteps would go by. It was dark now. Only a half-moon penetrated the night with its mellow light. Ellen heard the footsteps first. Then she saw the shadow that belonged to them. The man stopped walking 20 feet from where she was hiding. He stood silent for a minute with his back to her. Then he walked over to a bench at the lake's edge and sat down on it. In the bushes, Ellen was sweating. She wondered why she had ever stopped running. Nothing could be worse than this. The man must know she was hiding. Was he going to wait it out until she couldn't stand to hide any longer? Then Ellen thought that others might come along on the path. She would have to jump out of the bushes then and could walk out of the park with them. She looked over at the man on the bench again. He sat calmly looking out at the lake. Something caught her eye. There was a small shadow moving along the water's edge. It stopped. Silhouetted against the night sky, Ellen could see the head of a large rat. She started to get up off the ground. That was always her reaction to mice, to stand on a chair, to get up off the floor in any way possible. But now, she couldn't get up, and she couldn't let loose the scream choking in her throat. As if in a bad nightmare, 3 more rats joined the one by the lake. Ellen could see their fat shadows and their ugly rodent heads in the moonlight, and she could hear the clatter of their claws on the cement path. She wanted to scream, she wanted to run, but the bigger shadow on the bench scared her more. The rats not more than 5 feet away from him. He must see them, Ellen thought. She switched her eyes back to the rats. They hypnotized her with loathing fear. She heard a rustle in the bushes, not more than 2 feet from her. She had to gag her mouth with her sweater to keep from screaming. What if a rat came up to her? What if it jumped on her with its sharp claws? Then, with horror, Ellen saw that the 4 rats by the lake's edge were coming toward her. Their sharp rodent noses were pointing at her. Their long tails were switching back and forth. Ellen screamed. She saw the shadow on the bench stand up. It started to come at her toward the bushes. She struggled to her feet. As she took a step backwards, her foot fell into a deep hole. It was a rat's nest. Dozens of baby rats squealed in panic and crawled out of the hole around her foot. They were everywhere, scuttling away in desperation. Ellen jerked her foot out of the hole. As she stepped back again, her foot landed on the soft body of a baby rat. It squealed in agony, and Ellen screamed and screamed again. Then Ellen saw the shadow of the man moving closer and closer to her. She struggled to get out of the bushes, although her knees were weak with fear. Finally, she pushed her way through the thick branches and stepped onto the path going back up to the hill. The man had seen her. He came nearer. There in the pale moonlight, Ellen saw his face. Her body was filled with revulsion. It was the face of a huge rat, its whiskers twitching. Ellen ran. Terror, mindless terror, carried her down the path out of the park. She did not hear footsteps following behind her. All she heard was the high, unnatural squealing of rats. Ellen ran on and on until she finally escaped from the park. But the rat? She would never really escape him. He was still there, in her mind.
On her way home from the market, an old woman took a shortcut through the cemetery. She was so hungry, and the money she'd saved had barely filled her basket. As always, she wondered how she'd make it to the next week, though she always found a way. As she passed under a massive weeping willow, she noticed that several gravestones were missing, and some plots had even been dug up. For what reason, she had no idea. Looking around, she seemed to be alone in the graveyard. With her mind wandering, she failed to keep her eyes on the path before her, and she tripped over something, falling to the ground. Sore, she looked back to see a large stick, or rather, some kind of bone. She picked it up, eyeing it carefully, and looking around once again, seeing no one. Without another thought, she added the bone to her basket and continued on her way. She thought of the vegetables she carried, corn and onions, green beans and carrots. Her stomach grumbled, thinking of the delicious soup she'd have for dinner. Soup was so perfect this time of year, not to mention the many health benefits of bone broth. She started the pot of water immediately upon getting home, adding her fresh vegetables along with barley, potatoes, and seasonings. The bone boiled in the bottom of the pot, and the delicious stew simmered gently, saturating her entire home. A familiar meow made its way to her ears, and the woman opened her door to see the stray cat who often visited. Excited for the company, she invited her small friend in, providing a bowl of fresh water and a few bites of chopped carrots. When the soup was done, she sat with her bowl and savored every bite. It was delicious, and the large pot would surely last for days. The cat's starving eyes watched her as she finished, and she knew she had to share. The woman plucked the bone from the pot, still simmering, and fed one end into her meat grinder. The long boil made it a bit easier to grind the first few inches into a sand-like texture that piled onto a small plate she'd prepared. Growing up, her mother had taught her to use every last bit of any resource. This always included the animal bones, an excellent source of calcium and protein with barely any flavor of its own. Mixing the grindings with a mashed potato, she placed the rest of the bone back in the pot and set the plate in front of the cat, licking her spoon. They were both so spoiled, she thought. Hours later, she awoke in the dead of night as a terrified howl filled her ears. Illuminating her lantern, she squinted into the room, but the cat was nowhere to be found. She called for him, but he didn't come. The soft bubbling of the simmering soup was the only noise in the night around her, until she heard the voice.
Give me back my bone.
The woman turned to see the small window above her stove was now open, letting in the chilly night breeze. First the howling, and now... She was so tired, and the wind often groaned through the house, but this sounded so clear. Closing the window, she planned to look for the cat in the morning. She climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket over her and settling in. But then, she heard it again.
Give me back my bone.
The woman was still in the bed, eyes wide open. She just needed to wait until the sun was up, she told herself. She'd had too much to eat and was having a nightmare. She insisted to herself that there was no voice at all. But only a while later, the voice returned.
I want my bone back.
It came from right outside her door. She stole from the bed, plunging her hands into the scalding soup to retrieve the bone. She rushed to the window, opening it quickly, and tossed the bone into the darkness. "Take it!" she screamed. It was silent. Trembling, the woman shut the window once again with her charred hands and stepped back into her home. Had it worked? Was it gone? She could only hear herself breathe.
I want my bone!
The door burst open, and the woman screamed with mortal terror. "I gave you your bone! I gave it back! I'm sorry. I didn't know. I gave it back. What more do you want from me?" She sank into her bed as the being stepped through the doorway into her home.
I want the rest of it.